Greetings, everybody. And if you are one of those people that celebrates the little known holiday known as Christmas, apparently that's when people who practice the religion of Christianity celebrate the birth of somebody pretty important to them. Um, if you're celebrating that little known holiday, I know a lot of you may not have heard of it, but if you are celebrating that, Merry Christmas. If you were celebrating Hanukkah, happy belated Hanukkah, unless that's still going on, then just happy Hanukkah. I'm not sure if it's going on still. Uh, Happy Kwanzaa. If you're Muslim, happy belated Eid. And happy Festivus for the rest of us. This is Brian Freidenborg. It's my second show, my holiday special long edition of my podcast, Calling It Like It Is. I am an international affairs development and public policy professional, as well as a freelance writer, journalist, and historian. And this is my show where I basically talk about a lot of the major issues and stories going on in the world today, and also highlighting some other things that might not usually get as much attention. Today's a little bit of a mixed bag in our show. We're going to be talking about police shootings in general, and also use that to discuss race in America. That's going to all be also looked through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if that sounds crazy, I think I'll win you over by the end of my discussion on those issues. We're then going to discuss what I mean when I say I have in my little graphic, if you're watching this on YouTube, where I say there's no ideology here. We're going to discuss what it means to be partisan. We're going to discuss what it means to be biased, what ideology is, because I had a couple people, not too many, but a few people mentioned to me that they thought there was a bit of false advertising, that I was very liberal, and to say that there's no ideology here wasn't accurate. And I'm going to demonstrate that that accusation doesn't bear any merit, in part because taking a stance and having a side doesn't necessarily mean you're partisan. It doesn't mean you're ideological, and we will discuss that. And then finally, because it's the holiday season, we're going to be discussing a bit more of an esoteric, abstract, I want to really say metaphysical topic, but I'm going to be talking a bit about the Christmas spirit, what that means, what it's supposed to mean, what it should mean, what it actually means. And we're going to be talking about the Middle Eastern Christians here who have been suffering grievously under the onslaught of ISIS and the civil war of Syria especially, but also facing other issues in the region. And we're going to tie that all together with, what's the deal with Christmas. So those are my topics for today. It's a extra long special edition because it's the holidays. But now let's get started. Now we've seen a lot of tumult in the U.S. Ever since Michael Brown was shot, and we've had a series of events that have now culminated in this awful, despicable killing of two police officers in New York City who were just sitting in their cars. They weren't harassing anybody. They weren't oppressing people. They weren't, shooting unarmed minorities. They were just doing their job and hanging out in their car, and they got basically executed. This guy came up to them, apparently inspired by the events of Ferguson and with Michael Brown being shot, and this other man in Staten Island in New York City this man Eric Garner, who is apparently illegally selling cigarettes and then was very heavy set man, and then was choked to death in a chokehold while he was being subdued by police officers, and that was caught on camera. And there's been a bunch of protests since that, and other incidents. And this is a very, very complicated, sensitive series of events here that really illuminate a lot about the American justice system, about race in America. And it's not pretty. It's very disappointing on a lot of levels. And I think if we're going to be discussing this, believe it or not, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very good prism to be looking at this through. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of that, but what we're seeing right now in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and inside Israel, in the Palestinian territories of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, is a lot of anger on the part of Palestinians. What the Palestinian people have been through in Gaza and the West Bank has basically been really a brutal military occupation that denies them very basic rights, and that rules them through arbitrary military authority that can basically do whatever they want, and there are very little protections. If Israel wants to go and arrest someone, doesn't matter what the charges are, doesn't matter if they have any evidence, doesn't matter if the person should be arrested, that person will be arrested and detained for pretty much as long as the Israelis want. I mean, there's some limitations, but not many. And since 1967, when Israel took these territories over, they have had this occupation in place. It's still in place in the West Bank. The way the system was set up was ended in 2005 in Gaza, but as a lot of defenders and partisans of Israel will say, Israel left the Gaza Strip, and the occupation ended there. Well, that's not true. The Israeli ground forces left most of Gaza's territory, but they have continuously still occupied 17% of the land space, including a third of the farmland. That's pretty significant. Of that 17% includes a third of the farmland. And besides that, they have total control over Gaza's airspace. They have total control over Gaza's coastal waters. They maintain all control over all the land crossings between Israel and Gaza, and also the Egyptian border. They control who can move in or out, including into Egypt. They control most of the taxation, a lot of the civilian infrastructure and utilities, and travel between the West Bank and Gaza for Palestinians, and really travel anywhere, actually. So under international law, they actually still would be classified as the real authority, even if it's de facto or unofficial. Yes, Hamas controls a good part of the territory on the land, but when you factor all those other aspects of control in, they don't really control that much. So, basically Israel still controls Gaza for the most part, and definitely still controls the West Bank. And you've had millions of Palestinians now living since 1967, as well as Palestinian Israelis, that is, Israeli citizens that are Arab Palestinians who live in Israel. And also there's a bunch of several 100,000 Palestinians who do not have Israeli citizenship but live in East Jerusalem, which was also occupied in 1967, and they don't have Israeli citizenship, as I said, but they can vote in local elections. So the Palestinian Israeli citizens, sometimes called Israeli Arabs, they have the best deal. They have generally been pretty quiet, and have not really caused Israelis problems, the government or the people. The next tier would be the East Jerusalem Palestinians, and then the ones who really have it the worst are the Gaza and West Bankers, Gazans and the West Bankers. And what has been happening recently is people are so fed up that really for the first time we're seeing all three groups act out at the same time. And that did not happen. And the two main uprisings the Palestinians had against Israeli control, and starting late in 1987 and starting in late into the year 2000, those were West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. Those were not the Palestinian Israeli citizens. They sat that out. They weren't involved. But this is different, right? We had this horrible war war is not really even the right term, but this horrible operation and conflict in Gaza over the summer. Several dozen Israelis were killed. Over 2,000 Palestinians were killed. And these troubles started going on then. You start having a lot of protests and riots and ugly incidents. And what we've seen now, after all these years of occupation, and let's just explain what that means. I mean, as I said before, these people really have almost no rights when it comes to Israel. If Israel wants to go in and do something, if they want to go invade something or take control of something, or kick people out of a house or a village, they just do it. Once in a while, their Supreme Court, to its credit, Israeli Supreme Court reins them in, but for the most part, there's been almost no restrictions on what they do, and they're taking land. They're creating hard to imagine difficulties for any of us, but we're talking about being able to walk 10 minutes over a hill to see your cousin in the next town, and now having a wall or a Jewish Israeli series of residences being built on the top of that hill, and then you're not allowed to go, and then you have to go 3 hours around on a roundabout way and go through military checkpoints that half the time won't let you go anywhere anyway. And so these people are kind of prisoners and not free in their own land. And there's a lot of harassment. The Israelis will often pick people up just so they can find information out about them and try and turn them into a mole or a source of information, and blackmail them, even if they haven't done anything wrong. Obviously, there are a good number of Palestinians who are involved in stuff that the Israelis need to be worried about, and they certainly pick those people up too, detain them definitely often. They're subject to Israeli military law, unlike the settlers who get the benefits of Israeli civil law and citizenship. It's pretty bad. Physical abuse is not uncommon. We saw an American teen that was really beat up. This kid was like 15, I think, 16. If anyone remembers that story, he was an American Palestinian, and some Israeli police got caught in video beating the crap out of this kid. And he was protesting his cousin's death, who was also a kid who just got murdered by some extremist Israeli settlers, or maybe not settlers, I don't remember, but they were very extreme, crazy Israelis. There's a lot of crazy, extreme, violent people, unfortunately. Certainly not majorities of these people, of any of these groups, but there's plenty of bad apples to go around in this conflict. So it's a very, and then with Gaza, they're all crammed in a very small space and effectively aren't allowed to leave, and the conditions are terrible. And many of these people have been refugees since 1967. So they're really oppressed. They're seeing their land being taken from them gradually, slowly, but consistently. and they're denied basic rights, basic freedoms, and this has been going on since, again, 1967. I don't know any people that would have put up with that. The Jews during World War II that were in the Warsaw Ghetto certainly didn't like the Nazis having control over them, and they had an uprising. Who can blame them? And honestly, who can blame the Palestinians for resisting either? The Jews resisted against the Romans fiercely, even though they had no chance of having that succeed, and bravely, but very fatally, were defeated in those attempts. So, people don't like being under occupation. I don't care what religion, skin color, whatever you are. And, the Israelis definitely have legitimate concerns. They only have peace with two of their neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, and the rest, it's kind of a question mark. And there have been problems and invasions and terrorism and all kinds of stuff in the past, issues of Palestinians as well. Low-scale terrorism for a while until the first real uprising of the people late in 1987. So for 20 years they had these tit for tat, stuff going on with Yasser Arafat and PLO and all that. But what we're seeing now is, after this 9 months of failed peace talks that collapsed this summer, and then this war in Gaza, and what happened, and what the Netanyahu government was doing there, and the way Arabs in the area reacted, they're just very upset. And they're in a conflict with the state of Israel and its government. And so this is where we need to think about what's going on in the U.S., because there are similarities, and we'll get to that. But, that's a conflict. And people in uniform are agents of the state. They are, they represent the government. And to the Palestinian people, if you're in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, that's the Israeli military. When I say IDF, that's what I mean. Going forward, the Israeli military or Israeli police, you don't look at them as, oh, these people here to protect me. No, these people are here to work against you. That's how they see it. And that's very often, most of the time, in this case, true. And they are themselves being attacked often. We've seen these operations in Gaza and the West Bank in the past, and they've been very, and a lot of Palestinians end up dying. A lot of property ends up being destroyed. People lose their homes, their relatives, their loved ones. There's a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up. And then sometimes these individuals, not with any control from another group, not part of any terrorist organization formally or anything like that. Maybe they say, oh, I like this group, I'm with this group, but they're not really even involved. And they strike out, and they do awful things. They kidnap 3 poor kids, 4 teenagers, Israeli settler kids, in the West Bank, and murdered them, and that was awful. And that sparked partly helped to spark that crisis I mentioned from the summer. And when I mention the settlers, by the way, there are Jewish Israelis going into the West Bank, setting up shop, creating communities, and kicking Palestinians off their land, and then harassing the nearby Palestinians, taking the best water supplies and the best locations. And this has been going on since shortly after the 1967 occupation began. It really picked up in the last few decades. And now you basically have close to 400,000 Palestinian settlers in the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem. And they ruin the lives, essentially, of 2.5 million, more than that at this point, but 2.5 million, about 2.5 million Palestinians. And the whole system there is designed for those 400,000 people at the expense of the 2.5 million. Very South African apartheid-ish, in many ways. But so that's what I mean when I say settlers. So on top of all the oppression and occupation, they've got to deal with that, which is, So what we've started seeing over the last few months in Israel is, the Palestinian people do not have the stomach right now, I don't think so, for a mass uprising and an intifada. When I say intifada, that's Arabic literally for shaking off. And it was when the Palestinian people as a whole rose up and decided to try and shake off Israeli control. But it's come to mean uprising. because of that. So these two intifadas, uprisings, they don't have it in them for a major armed uprising again. In both those situations, the Palestinians lost way more than the Israelis, way more people killed, way more destruction, death, deprivation, you name it. It didn't work out well for them either time. So they're not looking for another mini war and large scale rebellion, but there are lots of people who are really upset, and we're seeing all these random people try and stab Israelis, try and driving their car and trying to ram into crowds of Israeli Jews, and all these weird little attacks, sometimes against soldiers. They're just standing guard, or officers, sometimes against civilians. And it's a problem. And we have to understand that frustration. But then here's what I would say about all this. All right. First of all, you have kind of three tiers of Israelis. You've got Israeli citizens inside Israel, and that's, to me, easily the least understandable and least excusable target for an attack by Palestinians. And then you've got the Israeli settlers, who are also civilians, but they are engaged in actively taking land and taking land from Palestinians and pushing Palestinians out of their homes. And they're very much part of the front line there, even if they're not soldiers. And many times settlers are going out and harassing Palestinians and physically abusing them and destroying their property. But they're also civilians. More understandable to me, if you're a Palestinian, you attack them, than going into Israel and attacking Israelis in their homes. I'm not condoning that, encouraging, or saying that that's a good thing. I'm saying that if you are looking at these attacks, you can separate attacks on Israeli civilians and attacks on settlers. To me, I'm against both. I don't think that's good for the Palestinian cause, and I don't think it's right to attack people like that. And then the third tier is Israeli government people, police, military. And it's one thing if Israelis are conducting an operation and attacking a Palestinian area, or they see a soldier or a police officer beating up another Palestinian or something, and they attack. So you're helping out your Palestinian friends, or you're defending your home. If the Israeli troops are coming in and they're blowing stuff up and attacking people, and you want to defend your home, I have no problem with that. You have a right to do that. I don't think everyone who attacked American troops in Iraq was a terrorist. I think some of those people just wanted to defend their homes. And that's tough. And at the same time, we've got to realize that, not all American soldiers in Iraq were down with what was going on, agree with that, or in Afghanistan. Not all Israeli soldiers are cool with the orders they get. But when you're in the military, you follow a code, you follow your orders. You are stuck doing what you got to do there. And there's certainly a lot of abuses, especially, with the IDF. I mean, there's a lot of documentation of this stuff, and it rarely gets punished or addressed. But, it's, to me, you have to make distinctions here. If the soldiers, as I was saying, are actively working against you and attacking, that's one thing. But if they're just standing outside a bank or something, and they're on guard, if they're inside Israel and just, off duty, or on duty and just guarding some kind of civilian infrastructure, or even just a base or something, I think that's a little different. Now, I mean, if things are really heating up, and you're attacking a military barracks, that's a little different. That's not the same as targeting civilians, And like, if we're talking about civilian deaths and all this, if you think about like a U.S. drone strike, targeting some guy who's really bad, killed a lot of people, but didn't know there's a wedding going on or something, and he accidentally kills a bunch of people at a wedding party with the drone strike, that's awful. It's a mistake. It's sad. And I look at an attack like that, and I look at maybe a suicide bomber or a terrorist targeting a military checkpoint, and I'm not, I don't get that in general with terrorism. It's not some emotional thing where I see red, and to me, terrorism is a tactic. When you have planes and tanks and F-16s and whatnot, you don't need to use terrorism. Terrorism is the weapon generally of the weak. It's asymmetric warfare against more powerful opponents. And we're so much more powerful than our enemies that they can't fight us with their militaries. We have to expect terrorism. It's the only thing that they can use. It's when you start targeting civilians that I have a real problem. But for me, the difference between a drone strike and a terrorist attack on a checkpoint, I'm not going to say one's morally righteous and the other's morally awful. There is a bit of a moral distinction, I'd say, but it's not as not as great as people would often suggest. That's different if the terrorist is targeting civilians. And the U.S., we have we have a few bad apples here and there, but we don't really target civilians. And we do try to take care, I would say, in contrast with Israel, and we'll get into that, really extraordinary care to avoid civilian casualties. Israel does have efforts in that regard as well, but again, we'll get into that. Okay, so I've made all these distinctions. All right, I don't condone most of these attacks, unless there's an active conflict going on. Just running up and stabbing a soldier or shooting him who's just standing around guarding something. I don't think that's right. I don't think that serves the cause of the Palestinian people and addresses their plight. But at the same time, we have to be able to understand why. Not with justifying it, but we have to understand why these attacks are happening. People are in a conflict, they're upset, they want to strike out, they don't have much power, so they have to go after targets that aren't suspecting when it's not in the middle of a conflict. Because if it's the IDF with their tanks and their really well-equipped army, and you're just a Palestinian guy in a keffiyeh with an AK-47, that's not a fair fight. But I don't think terrorism is fair either. So they're kind of like equalizers, and it's ugly. That's why I hate fighting war and all this stuff. It's ugly. So you have to understand, though, what you've got is Palestinians for decades now living under a system that doesn't respect them, that doesn't listen to them, that doesn't acknowledge them, that does not address their needs as not responsive to them, that actively oppresses them. And people are going to strike back at this system. And if that means they look at people in uniform and say, you're part of the system, boom. If that means they look at settlers the same way. It's hard for me to say that that's completely 100% not logical. There is a logic to it. I don't like it, and I don't condone these attacks, and that's not what I would suggest is a good path for Palestinians to follow. I think they're wrong. But we look at these attacks, we have to say they're wrong, but we also have to say the whole system oppressing Palestinians, the occupation, what the Israeli government's doing is wrong. They don't cancel each other out. It's not a contest. They're very related, but they're also separate, and they're tied to each other. And the more you have of one, the more you're going to have of the other. And that's that to me is what we need to keep in mind in the U.S. Because if we look at the U.S., what we have to do is look at this situation. We have to look at what Black Americans really go through today, even in 2014. All right? And we have to understand that there's a tremendous amount of frustration from a system that's also very oppressive and not responsive. It's certainly not the same as the Israeli military occupation. But it's awful. And I'm going to go into that, actually. Nicholas Kristof who's one of my favorite columnists. I don't get to read him often enough. He's excellent. He wrote a series of 4 columns titled When Whites Just Don't Get It. And there's a lot of whites that really don't get it. And that to me is really the biggest problem overall. Same thing with Israel, actually. Israel's got the power there, but they don't really get it. And until they do, the overall situation is not going to change, and it's probably going to keep getting worse. And it's the same thing in the U.S. Until the white public in general really gets it, we're in for some discord. Now, Christoph started his series of columns with some very important statistics. And for me, these are things that people need to be aware of. There's no excuse in 2014 to be to not acknowledge these very stark facts, because they're real. And I bet a lot of you aren't familiar with what I'm going to explain here, but really, these statistics paint a picture that we all need to be concerned about and working on. For one thing, if you look at the net worth of an average black household in the U.S., in the United States, and this is from the year 2011, it is $6,314. If we look at the net worth of an average white household from 2011 census data, it's $110,500. That's $110,000 versus $6,300. $110,500 versus $6,300. That is mind-boggling. And you have to think about what's a household and how does a household get built, and wealth and money and advantages passing from generation to generation, and what blacks were denied for so long, and why even in 2014 that's the situation that we have. 6,000 to 110,000. That's less than 6% of that means a black household generally is less than 6% the value of a white household. That's amazing. And we have to think about apartheid South Africa, because as Christoph points out, at its peak, okay, in the 70s, in 1970, all right, the wealth, ownership, possession gap, what whites there owned versus blacks, they owned 15 times more than blacks in South Africa. Okay, this is in 1970. A factor of 15. Okay, 15 times more stuff in the hands of whites than blacks on average. In the U.S. in the year 2014, today, it's now 18 times as much stuff that white people have compared to blacks. That's an even greater gap, an even greater distinction between black and white in America in 2014 than in apartheid South Africa. Just that alone should be a wake-up call, but there's plenty more to discuss. Things are actually getting worse for blacks than they were before. The black person has an income that's, compared to what a white person makes, the gap between black and white is actually 40% worse. The difference, the gap, is growing. 40% worse than it was in 1967. That means a black man and a white man were earning closer to the same amount of money in 1967 than they are today. If you're a black boy and you're born today in the US, your average life expectancy is going to be 5 years less than a white boy. There's some other statistics. This isn't from Christoph, but the unemployment rate for blacks is more than twice the unemployment rate for whites. And when you think about a recession, it's one thing in the 90s. Like when the 90s, we were I think a little bit more racially sensitive and conscious, and times were going well. So it's one thing in society when things are going well, and then you're conscious of the plight of people less fortunate than you. What the real test of a society is when things are difficult and what happens then. And we've been going through recession, a very tough economic era in the US, and that's when it's harder on minorities now. We're seeing the black unemployment rate growing, and it's harder for them in the recession. They are the hardest hit minorities in the recession, far more than white people. So that's something important to keep in mind. Christoph also talks about there's a game where, and this was done for academic research purposes, where you're a cop, you got a gun, you're supposed to shoot the guy with the gun, but not the other people. And people will pop up. This reminds me of a game I played Nintendo a long time ago. But, in this situation, and Christoph, it speaks to subconscious conditioning. Christoph had the same problem. And black people too. People would shoot the black person more quickly than the white person. They would shoot the black person without the gun more often than the white person without the gun. Even if they had guns, there was still the gap. If the white person had the gun, maybe they wouldn't shoot him or they'd take longer. But if the black guy had a gun, boom. And this is to measure those responses. And there's a gap in time and frequency and how quickly and how often. Okay? If you're a black person in Louisiana, for example, you will be 97% more likely to be sentenced to death for murdering someone who's white than if you murder someone who's black. We've got some other bad statistics on crime. You've got if you're a black person who doesn't finish high school, there is a 70% chance that you will be in jail at some point in your life. In fact, if you're a black man in your 20s without a high school diploma, you have a better chance of being in jail than having a job. There was also a study which showed that white felons, white people with felony convictions on their record, had about the same chance of getting a job as a black man with a college degree. It's a college-educated black man versus a white convict having about the same chance of being employed. There was another study which had a bunch of resumes, and they put typically sounding black names on the resumes, and then more typically sounding white names on other resumes, but they were the same resumes. And 50% more callbacks for the people with the white sounding names. The law enforcement, though, is always giving blacks more scrutiny as well. Blacks do commit a higher percentage of crime than their proportion of the population would suggest, but then they're also arrested for way more offenses than white people relative to the amount of crime being committed. For example, New Jersey Turnpike. All right, 15% of the drivers on the Turnpike are minorities. All right, blacks are 42% of the people that get pulled over by police officers. Blacks in the city of Seattle. 16% of drug dealers for the five most dangerous drugs, but there's 64% of the arrests. So 84% of drug dealers in Seattle are not black for the hard drugs, but then 64% of the arrests are black drug dealers. I mean, there's all kinds of other crimes and other data on that basically white people will commit the same crime and get either a lesser sentence, or they don't get arrested or prosecuted the same way and as often as black people do. The education system, that's just dismal for so many young black students who live in very mainly black neighborhoods compared to white schools. I mean, to mainly white schools, it's a huge difference. And the money, our school systems are based on local taxes. So obviously, richer communities have more money. They get better teachers, better resources. That's also a huge problem. So now we think about, the police shootings. And, way too many young black people, young black men, are being shot by police, often unarmed, often not committing a crime. And it's not just young black men, too. It's just black people in general. Apart from the situation with Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Eric Garner is the man who was choked to death in Staten Island. There's been a whole bunch of other incidents recently in the news. Just look this up on the internet, and there's just so many, and they just keep happening. It's almost always black people, not white people. And that's not that it never happens to white people, but really it's happens so much more often than to white people. Happens so much more often to black people than white people. And we had the example of a man not too long ago, a few months ago, who was looking at an air rifle in Walmart. If you've ever been to Walmart, you know they have a bunch of guns on sale there. And he's looking at this air rifle. He takes it off the shelf. He's holding it. He's walking around. He's pointing down at the ground. Some idiot calls the police, and, there's a black guy with a gun. And the police arrive, and they just shoot the guy. And he ends up dying. The guy was just shopping for an air rifle. And he's with his girlfriend, and they detain his girlfriend, and they for like an hour and a half, they like interrogate her and try and pressure her into saying he brought the gun or whatever. They're not even telling her that he died. She doesn't even know he died. All right? In Cleveland, there was a young boy with 12 years old, I think, 11 or 12, and he had a toy gun. And the police officer just shot him, and the kid died. I'm just giving you a couple stories here, but again, go online. They happen all throughout the year. You just keep reading them and reading them and reading them. Okay? Now, that should be separated from, when there are black people committing crimes and then they are shot when they have guns and are armed. That's different. But you keep bringing about these situations with people that are unarmed. And anyone from the New York area can remember from, if they're close to my age or even younger. I hope I say his name right. I think it's Amadou Diallo. This guy who was just not armed or anything, and he was shot something like 80 times by the police. There was another situation not too long ago where a black guy was getting married to his wife, and he's the groom in the wedding, and he was somewhere walking around, and he got shot by police. People try to take out their ID or their wallet to show the police, and the police think they have a gun, and they get shot. And again, this keeps happening to black people in a way that it does not happen to white people. And let's go back to Israel-Palestine now. Okay, I've just given you all these stats on black life in America and how incredibly uneven. I mean, $110,000 to $6,000. That's what the average household, and everything else, and what all that means. And you've got to understand what the history of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation does. There was actually a study where and Christoph points this out, where you even can look at the counties in the U.S. where slavery was most concentrated. There were the most amount of slaves. And those counties today have higher levels of inequality between black and white, higher levels of black poverty than states where there weren't slavery, was not slavery, or where there were less concentrations of slaves. So don't tell me slavery has nothing to do with it. Slavery is all in the past, and that's that. Don't tell me that Jim Crow and all this stuff doesn't make a difference. The white household, 110,000, that didn't happen overnight. Those are generations of people passing stuff on, right? And you look at black immigrants into the U.S. from the Caribbean islands, from Africa. They have social mobility. It's not the same as white people who emigrate, but they after time they start doing better and their situation improves more relative to African Americans. So we need to, we're talking about slave descent African Americans for the most part in the U.S. in a lot of these statistics. With the crime stuff, it's different. When people are being arrested or randomly shot, officers don't really know they're not making that distinction. But a lot of people after Obama got elected, oh, we have a black president, post-racial society, there's no more racism in America, blah, blah, blah. And actually there are studies which even show that white people think they're the ones who experience more discrimination and that they're more oppressed now than blacks, which is insane. That's a really cocooned fantasy land that some people are living in, because the information is there. You can look it up, but they don't want to. And that's the big part of the problem for me. The biggest part of the problem for me is white resistance to even acknowledging that there's a problem and to dealing with it. And you look at Obama, he got elected, and people want to say, okay, it's a dead issue, move on. I'm sorry, but Barack Obama was born to a white mother, and a white mother growing up in Obama's time did not have to deal with a lot of the issues black mothers did. Single mother, the father wasn't around, but the father was a Kenyan. He wasn't an American. He wasn't an American slave descent. He wasn't dealing with Jim Crow and segregation. That's not the African American experience, okay? Being raised by a white mother and having an absent African father, that's not what's going on with African Americans in the United States. So Obama's election was obviously still impressive. It's a black man sitting in the White House as the president, not the butler. That movie came out over the summer, I think, with Forrest Whitaker or something, which looked interesting, about JFK's butler. But this is a black man running the United States of America. It's amazing. It's great. That doesn't speak to improvement or change or closure on any of those issues that I've been talking about for the African American community. It's apples and oranges. Obama is not of that community. Okay, he's not one of them. It's not a success for them. They still celebrate it. They're still very happy. I mean, they're both black. Sure, they share that. But Obama's experience in America is very atypical of African Americans, and we have to realize that Obama's election doesn't mean that these people all of a sudden are in an equal playing field with everybody else. That's obviously, indisputably not the case, as all the numbers I just gave prove. So we have to understand that. And we have to understand that it's actually getting worse, as I mentioned. The gap is getting worse. Economic problems are getting worse. The unemployment is now worse for African Americans with our recession and coming out of it. The debacle of the late 2008 crisis that we're still kind of dealing with. So we have a system that for hundreds of years has enslaved and discriminated and oppressed black people, that still treats them dramatically unequally, even to the point where doctors don't give black people the same amount of pain medication when they're treating them and operating on them. I mean, just all these subtle biases that people don't think about, but they're there. And actually, one of my favorites is this study where they had a bunch of little kids, because society conditions this in us, and it's in black minds as well too. It conditions them: white good, black bad. Little kids were shown pictures of other children, black boys, black girls, white boys, white girls, and they were asked who's good and who's bad. And whether the kids are black or white, they would look at the white kids and say, good, he's good. Well, what about the black child? What about the black boy? Bad. They would point and say bad. And these are black kids doing it too. It's just society condition. You see what's in the media, and to a degree that is something of a reflection of the awful reality of the black American experience today. But society conditions people to think that way. And it's alive, it's subconscious. So if you're not aware that you're discriminating against, if you're interviewing people for jobs and you're not aware that you're inherently less likely to look at the black person and not factor that into your decision making, and you just don't even think about it, you're part of the problem. If you don't acknowledge the problem, you're part of the problem. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. So again, this is a really systemic, nationwide, societal thing going on here. And I'm not saying there hasn't been any improvement. Obviously, there has been. People aren't burning crosses on people's front lawns anymore. Thank you, KKK, for evolving. But the point is, we also have a system here that has been making things worse for blacks, that is oppressing them, that is not responsive, where just like the Palestinians, a black person generally will see someone in uniform in a lot of situations, and they're not going to feel that that person's there to protect them. They're going to feel that that person's out to get them and not feel safe around them. There was an article I read not too long ago. It was something along the lines of "Don't call police. Don't call the police." A lot of times people are black. They really don't want the police involved, even if there's a criminal situation going on. Once that situation gets opened, we've seen, an unattended black child playing in a park. There was a few stories like this in the news not too long ago. And the authorities will take that child away from the black mother and send the child to social services, even though white mothers do the same kind of stuff. I mean, and it doesn't happen at the same rate. So there's just so many problems. And with these police shootings, you can see why there's this frustration. You can see that they're fed up with the system. There's a lot of anger. Does that mean that people should be rioting? Does that mean that they should start stabbing police? Or besides the two New York City police officers that were murdered in cold blood, honestly, I consider that a terrorist act. The same thing as Palestinian guy running up and stabbing an Israeli soldier. It's an act of terrorism. But again, it's just a tactic. It's a tactic that the oppressed generally are using to voice their frustration. I don't agree with it. It's not right. It's essentially murder. These cops had nothing to do specifically with the Eric Garner situation or any of these other situations. The two cops that were killed, one was Hispanic, the other was Asian. So there's a sick irony there that one minority guy who was very upset about what was going on, he was very clearly thinking about this, and this had to do with that. He was inspired by these shootings of young black men and other situations that resulted in the death of young black men to take a revenge attack out on these police. But it's stupid, it's awful, it's despicable, it's horrendous. It's the same as the guy in Israel that went into the mosque and killed several people. I'm sorry, in a synagogue. He killed several Jews worshiping in a synagogue. Despicable. Awful. That's not going to improve the situation of Palestinians. Killing these cops is not going to help African Americans in their situation, it's awful. And besides that, in America, we had a guy tried to take a hatchet to a cop in New York, and another guy in D.C. attacked a cop with an axe. And we're starting to see these random, kind of related, but lone wolf situations, the same way we're seeing random people in Israel and the Palestinian territories attack Israelis as individuals. And, it's frightening to see this type of stuff in the U.S. because it's just starting now, but the can of worms is opened. And what's going to happen? Is it going to keep getting worse? Maybe not right now, but at some point, you hate to see this. 20 years from now, to see the statistics be even worse for Black people and to have it be not horribly uncommon, like it's not horribly uncommon in Israel, for people to attack people like this based on this oppression and these conflicts. And that's not to say that most African Americans, or even a huge minority of them, support this and are involved in these attacks. Same thing with the Palestinians and Israelis. Most Israeli Jews are not running around trying to harass Palestinians. Most Israeli soldiers aren't trying to be super abusive, although many of them are when things get really ugly. But most Israelis, most Palestinians are not attacking people and committing terrorism and murder and beating people up. Okay? But there's a very sizable, not huge, but there's still a very sizable minority of people doing all these things. Okay? It's not like there aren't a good amount of bad apples among Israeli security forces and settlers doing awful things to Palestinians. It's not like there aren't a good number of bad apples that are Palestinians committing terrorism. It's not like there aren't a good amount of bad apples among the African American community. They're out there committing crimes that the police have to confront. There is a reason that cops feel more nervous around Black people than white people. Even Jesse Jackson, a very famous American Black activist, for any of my international viewers who might not know him, Jesse Jackson said, and I'm paraphrasing, but hey, I go to the ATM, I come out with my cash, I start hearing some running footsteps behind me, I turn around, I see it's a white person, I breathe a sigh of relief. All right? But that doesn't mean that we just profile people. It doesn't mean that we can look at the attacks of Palestinian terrorists, that we look at the attacks and riots that Blacks and other minorities engage in the U.S. and say, that's the problem. No, we've got separate problems here. We have separate things. They're very related, but they're still separate. We can't have attacks, Palestinian terrorism and attacks do not cancel out the occupation and the oppression of the Israeli forces and the Israeli government. Okay? The murder, the awful murder of these two police officers. And my dad's, I never got to meet him. He died before I was born, but my dad's father, my grandfather, was a New York City precinct captain. And this is during the Great Depression, so I'm sure he had to deal with some crazy stuff going on back then. Okay? An Irish American cop. Great guy. I wish I knew him. But most of these police officers are trying to protect us. And they're trying to protect society. But there are these horrible biases. And like I said, it's not just a few bad apples. So on the one level, these are public servants, and we have to extend them, to a degree, a benefit of the doubt in certain situations. But we can't take that benefit too far. And that's what's going on with these situations with Black Americans, because there's never any kind of indictment or conviction or whatever. And a lot of times these situations, clearly, we can't know sometimes with 100% certainty, but, clearly the police officer messed up. And this happens again to Blacks in a way with a frequency that does not happen to whites. And I get it. Look, being a cop, you are risking your life. But you know what? That's also part of the territory. And we actually found, there was a recent Washington Post article that 2013 was the safest year for being a police officer in 56 years. Only 111 police officers in the entire U.S. died from attacks like that in line of duty. Died in the line of duty in 2013. And 2014 was the second lowest year on record. And we've only got a few days left there, so it's probably going to stay that way. Hopefully. Okay, so it's actually safer now being a police officer today than it has been in the past. And that's been consistently dropping in general over the years. And at the same time, we look at how many people are the police killing. Well, this is a problematic statistic because it's very incomplete with the data. The way this works is a lot of departments voluntarily report, some voluntarily report this information, but a lot don't. And what we had for 2013, maybe it was 2011, but very recently we had, I think it was 2013, over 400 people were killed by police officers in what was deemed justifiable homicide, quote unquote. Now that means the police department determined that the police officer, somebody in the line of duty, and that the circumstances made it okay. If they're not sure and there's an investigation, that doesn't make it into the statistic for that year because those investigations take a long time. And often when the investigation is resolved, it's a year or more later, and the statistic doesn't get updated. And again, this is a partial reporting. If it's unjustifiable homicide, if the cop is definitely wrong and that's the determination, there's not a special category for that. It just goes into the general murder pool. Okay, we don't have separate statistics for police officers when they kill people, and they shouldn't. And let's be honest, a lot of times when there are these investigations, I mean, like I said, most of these police officers are good people, but maybe you do make a mistake and you shoot somebody you know you shouldn't. You're worried your life's going to be over, so you are going to cover up a lot of times and do or say or change evidence or whatever to make it look like you did the right thing. And maybe you'll feel bad about it, but that's human nature. When people screw up, they want to cover up what they did. That's every profession. No one wants to come completely clean. If they can make it look like it wasn't their fault, great. Okay, that's not unique to police, but that happens a lot. And the point is, in the analysis I read, and it makes perfect sense, that this number of 400 is actually far lower than whatever the real number is, based on the partial, incomplete reporting and the other stuff I mentioned. Okay? Now, compared to England and Wales, which officers last year killed 2 or 3 people, and Germany, which is a pretty big country, it killed 6 people, police officers. That's compared to 400. So even if you adjust for population and all that, okay, the population differences, that is huge. A huge difference. I mean, and maybe it's related to the fact that we have so much more guns and gun violence per capita than almost any other country, developed country. Maybe they're related, maybe the issue of us having too many guns and all the gun violence, and the NRA is ridiculous on this stuff. And I've written about this before. You can check out articles, search my name at mikemic.com, or you can see them on my website as well, brianfreinborg.com. I've written a lot about this stuff, actually. And it's ridiculous. So there's almost certainly a correlation there. But, we're violent. We're a violent society, and the cops reflect that. And they kill more people than other comparable countries by far. And we've really got to look at this. And we've got to look at why it's so many more blacks than whites. And it's depressing how tribal this all ends up being, because what we found is that after the Michael Brown incident, white people became even more supportive of local police. When in the poll that was looking at this, they became the most supportive that they've ever been since this statistic has been measured, going back at least a decade. And black people, obviously, predictably, had less confidence and less, support. White people thought that the police were treating blacks fairly, and blacks obviously didn't because they don't. But it's amazing. After these incidents, that white people would become more supportive and feel even less so that there's a problem. This goes in with that insane statistic where white people think that they're more oppressed than blacks. It's unbelievable. And let's look at this incident real quick, but to close this out with Michael Brown, okay? Because, and this goes to a point I mentioned before when I was talking about Israel and Palestine, but with Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, the officer that killed him, this is a 17-year-old young man, kid, a teen. He's a big guy, right? When apparently Michael Brown came after the officer at some point in the confrontation, Officer Darren Wilson said that the boy was like a demon. I don't know if he would have said that about a white person, but a demon. I mean, you're a trained police officer. You're there. Your primary duty is not protecting yourself, but protecting the citizenry. That's your job, and you signed up for it. No one made you go do it. It's the same thing with soldiers. It's like I really feel for them. They're in a tough situation, but that's a risk that they assume with the position as well. Whether you're an officer or a soldier. There's things that come with the territory, okay? And actually, it's interesting because in the Iraq War, we were copying Israeli tactics and doctrine. We were being advised by them. We were actively seeking their input and consulting them on what to do in Iraq. And one scholar noted this in some ways led to the Palestinization of Iraq. Now, let me back up a little bit here and say that, and talk about Israeli military doctrine. One of the people who wrote the Israeli Army's ethics manual, and in that ethics manual and in this article written by one of those people as well, the doctrine comes clearly out as anything that's going to increase the risk to Israeli troops and Jewish life is unacceptable. And it doesn't matter whatever has to be done to preserve Jewish life is right. And if it's going to increase the risk to our troops, we're not going to do it. So that's how you saw in Gaza this summer, which is one of the most densely populated places in the world, where the Israeli army sat back and used massive artillery bombardments of entire areas, entire civilian neighborhoods. No wonder so many people were killed. Obviously, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, it's not like they didn't use any restraint and just napalm the whole area, but still, that's not a tactic that the U.S. would really do. When we were starting to copy some of these tactics, we ended up having problems. And what's interesting is we were noticing that when we were kind of following the Israelis' advice in Iraq, the population turned against us more. We lost sources of intelligence. The population became more hostile. The operating environment became less secure and more dangerous. And we realized this is bad and it wasn't working. And so General David Petraeus in his counterinsurgency manual and some other officers, and also in the Army report on civilian casualty policies, we shifted very appropriately. We started to say and realize, and what Petraeus wrote is that if you're if you are not being careful, even if you're being very good about not exposing the troops to risk, but you use tactics that inflict much more pain and suffering and death on civilians, what's going to happen is they're going to turn against you. You're going to lose intelligence that can save lives. You're going to operate in an environment that's more hostile to you, more dangerous to the troops, and it's going to make the mission harder to complete, and or maybe even make it impossible, and you're going to face more danger. So it's better in the short term to expose your troops to more risk using tactics that will not harm civilians as much, because in the long run, besides not killing as many innocent people, in the long run, the mission is going to have a better chance of success, and the mission operating environment is going to be more conducive to success. That's the U.S. military adjusting in just a few years in Iraq, okay? The Israelis don't have any, their system doesn't have the capacity to even think about that. They're just thinking tactically. For whatever reason, actually they're very specific reasons, but we're not going to go into that here. But yeah, so what this one military scholar writing, I think, for a program in the Naval Postgraduate School, I believe, in the U.S., was saying is that we've basically, if you're a military operating in an environment where you are operating, you are the governing legal authority under international law. That makes you responsible for the welfare of the civilians where you are operating. Okay? You're the government, basically. And he's saying it's silly to say that troops should really recklessly endanger their lives to avoid any civilian casualties. That can't work for the mission. They can't work for the operation. It's incredibly unfair to the soldiers. At the same time, he's saying you cannot transfer all of the risk onto the civilians. That as a soldier and as the authority there, part of the territory, part of what you assume in that role is a degree of risk, and you need to take additional risks that are reasonable to limit civilian casualties. Even if it risks your own life more, that's part of the territory. Now, obviously, you don't, like I said in the beginning, you don't want to take that too far. So there's a balance. What he says, you have to have a balance between not transferring any of the risk to the civilians and totally endangering your own life, but also to not transfer 100% or the vast majority of the risk onto innocent non-combatant civilians. Okay? And it's the same with police in the U.S., all right? And these are your people, and it's it can't just be protect yourself at all costs for the police officer either, just like it can't be for the military. And in this situation, I think about the situation with Darren Wilson, and yeah, he felt threatened. George Zimmerman felt threatened too. Now, George Zimmerman wasn't an officer, so it's different. It's just between civilians, which to me is not as bad, because when you're a public servant, it's your duty and obligation to inflict as little harm as possible on the people you're supposed to be protecting. Even if it's a suspect, you don't know if that person is guilty or not, or whatever's going on. Okay? Now, George Zimmerman wasn't an officer, though, all right? He was also an idiot, George Zimmerman. I mean, I believe he felt threatened, but he shouldn't have. That was silly. It was his paranoia and sort of, racism probably was part of it. Not necessarily active, but certainly prejudiced views seem to have been, maybe not certainly, but pretty certainly. But with Darren Wilson, to me, this is a clear example, and we can't know for 100%, we can't know with 100% certainty, but to me, this is a clear example of an officer transferring all the risk onto the civilian. Because if you're a trained police officer, you should be able to subdue an unarmed civilian without having to resort to killing that civilian and ending that civilian's life. You should be able to use your training to think coolly in a frantic, dangerous situation, because that's the job. If you're a police officer, you don't get to freak out every time you're in danger, pull out your gun, and start firing to kill because you feel threatened. That is not how it's supposed to work. That's not how it should work. Okay? You're assuming some risk. Now, shooting, I think Michael Brown was shot 6 times, and perhaps other shots were fired, but he was shot 6 times. Did this guy really need to be shot 6 times to bring him down? Could you not have shot him several times, once in each knee or something? I mean, he was shot in the head, I think multiple times in the head. Shot in the head. When you start shooting someone in the head, they better be about to kill you or severely injure you. Other than that, I don't know why you're shooting someone in the head. If someone has a gun, that's different. Even then, hopefully you can incapacitate them and not kill them. But especially if someone's not armed, I just don't see how most of the time, and I'm not saying there aren't situations, there certainly are, but they're rare. And I can't imagine in this situation how Darren Wilson needed to kill Michael Brown to preserve his own life. And, that's the problem. This type of stuff happens when it shouldn't, and it happens way too often for black people. And it's symptomatic, whether it's the net household worth $110,000 to $6,000, them being locked up at higher rates and more often for crimes, with stiffer penalties than white people when they do the same stuff. I mean, the entire society is basically stacked against black people on average. It's not to say that you don't have someone like Obama and you don't have successful black people, but I'm sorry, we're talking about the big picture. In the big picture, it's clear. It is clear. And, for me, the bigger problem is the societal discrimination. Just like the bigger problem in Israel is the occupation. There were 20 years of occupation before there was any kind of widespread terrorism with mass participation. You had small groups doing stuff, but it wasn't involving the people, and they were not actively engaged. Okay, so for me, you're not going to see as much terrorism. Not that it will go away. And I do consider the incident in New York with the 2 police officers being shot terrorism, shot to death. But to me, you've got to deal with the larger systemic issues to see a reduction in terrorism and violence and riots and that kind of stuff. Because violence is an expression generally expressions from groups of people that feel they don't have other options to affect the change that they want to see. And these groups are very justified in their grievances, whether they're African Americans or Palestinians. That does not mean that their violence is justified. But if the system works so strongly against them, it doesn't give them other ways to improve their situation, or makes it so much harder than for everybody else, and keeps them down and oppresses them. Violence is something of a natural reaction. It's still wrong. Okay, we condemn the terrorism, condemn the attacks, condemn the murder of these police officers, condemn the murder of Jews in synagogues. That's awful. But also condemn the occupation. Also condemn the system in the U.S. that is so unfair to black people. Condemn these police shootings of unarmed black men. It just doesn't happen to white people the same way. So white people, we're the ones with most of the power here. If we don't stand up and demand change, obviously it's not going to happen, because blacks have been doing this for years and complaining about this stuff, and nothing's changed. So we really, need to get on this. And just a quick thought on that: body cameras do work wonders. We have seen studies, even though the Eric Garner thing was taped, and that didn't result in a good outcome. In general, both civilians and police officers are more likely to be on better behavior when they're being videotaped. Okay. So as Nick Kristof states in one of his columns, if you're a young white guy and you make some mistakes, government, society, our whole system is quite forgiving. But if you're a young black man and you make some mistakes, our government, our society, and our whole system is not very forgiving. It can actually be quite harsh, and often is. So anyway, that's that. So race is going to be part of this second topic as well. But I'm here to talk about ideology, bias, partisanship, and all that. As a few people mentioned that they thought I was engaging in false advertising by saying that there is no ideology here on this show. Now, let's use this very typically used example, but if someone has a Holocaust denier on their show and they refuse to acknowledge any of their points and say you're just crazy, that's wrong. The host is not biased. He's not being ideological. He is not partisan. Okay? He's doing his job. He is basing his approach on facts. He's being reasonable, and he's confronted with a position that is not reasonable or based on facts. And when you have craziness like that, the proper response is not to be quote-unquote balanced, not to give that person equal time, not to give equal weight to that argument. It's to call the craziness out as being crazy, to call nonsense what it is, and to stand up for facts and rationally based arguments. So yeah, I actually am very liberal in a lot of ways. But there are plenty of times when I disagree with my own side. For example, when the Democratic Party in 2006 wanted to withdraw immediately from Iraq, I felt that if that was something we had done, then we would have created a horrible situation for the Iraqi people, and that far more people would have died in a much shorter period of time than if we tried to bring more stability first, or if we ever did decide to leave, than if we did it over a gradual period of time and not too rapidly. And I would even say that today, the situation in Iraq is not caused by our withdrawal as much as it was caused by spillover from the Syrian civil war, which we didn't really have much to do with. But anyway, I was calling out my side. You know, I'm liberal. I vote Democratic. But that doesn't mean, you know, I have to feel like I have to support Democrats all the time if they're wrong. You know, and I voted for Republican a few times. Chris Shays was my representative in Connecticut, and I believe I voted for him twice. He was the last Republican in the House of Representatives from New England before he lost. So yeah, I don't consider myself that partisan. Right now, a lot of liberals are very, very, very pacifist, and in general, I'm a pacifist too. But I'm a pacifist that believes in the least violence possible and ending wars. And sometimes to end a war, a really hot war that's raging, where lots of people are dying, it requires outside military force to stop the parties from killing each other. And in the short term, that means more casualties. It means years and years of killing that would have gone on and on and on are stopped. I don't think World War II would have just burned out on its own in a situation that would have left us with many Jews left in the world, and many Russians or other people. U.S. intervention was absolutely necessary in World War II in Europe. And, you know, so sometimes it takes violence to end violence. Cops do not show up at an armed robbery with chocolates and an invitation to sit down and chat. They show up armed. So, and that is them arriving on a scene where there's already a conflict and intervening. I don't think anyone would say that that's warmongering behavior, intervening to stop violence. So for me, a lot of people on the left there are completely against any intervention in Syria. And I don't want a ground invasion in Syria, but I think besides bombing ISIS, we can take out the regime's air force Assad's Air Force and his heavy weapons, and that would help civilians a lot and reduce a lot of the killing that's going on. But anyway, that's not ideological for me. The ideological pacifists would say war is always not the answer. And to me, ideological means you have the answer for every situation. You don't first look at the situation, analyze it on its own, and ask what's the best solution based on facts and research pertaining to this specific and or similar situations. You say war's not the answer. No invasion, no airstrikes, no nothing. Even if in that situation, that is not necessarily the case. Okay? And this is where I have my problems with Republicans. They're extremely ideological, especially these days. You know, almost invariably, the Republican solution for the economy is tax cuts and less regulation. It doesn't matter what the situation is or the specifics. They say the same thing almost every time, almost every major candidate. Less taxes and lower regulation, and that will fix unemployment and the economy and whatever. And we've seen the way these tax cuts work, that they really don't create jobs and they don't fix the economy. We had the Bush tax cuts, which were $1 trillion or more, and that did not fix the situation at all. The economy did not improve for most Americans, and jobs did not come back from those tax cuts. So the problem I have with these Republicans is that they're very ideological. They don't tend to look at the individual situations. They tend to repeat the same answers for almost everything. Sometimes they're right, though. I'm with John McCain and other Republicans that we should be more involved in Syria, in stopping that awful conflict, stopping the killing, stopping the fighting, and the creation of refugees, and stopping the displacement. That doesn't make me ideological, but with the Republicans in general, they're just so wrong on so many issues, on every major issue that I can think of, with the exception of the Syria thing I mentioned. Now let's talk about evolution, for example, okay, which almost no scientists really dispute the general concept, maybe certain specifics, but certainly not the general concept. In 2009, only 54% of Republicans believed in that, with 39% saying we have existed, we were created the way we were, and that's it. Presumably by God. Fast forward to 2013. The 54% that believed in evolution have dropped 11 points to 43%. That's less than half Republicans now. With 48%, meaning a higher number, saying we've existed since the beginning, created in our present form. That's pretty mind-boggling. If I find 2 Republicans, there's a greater chance one of them doesn't believe in evolution. That's what that means. Okay. Now, Democrats in 2009, we had 64%, which is 2/3. It's still embarrassing. There's actually about a third. 64% believed in evolution. 30% did not. That's 2009, but we actually went up. 2013 up to 67%, so slightly over 2/3, and then down to 27. So about 1 out of every 4 Democrats believes in that kind of creationist stuff. If we look at global warming as an issue, 84% of Democrats say this is Pew, a recent survey as well. 84% of Democrats say there's solid evidence that the Earth is warming. Only 46% of Republicans say that. On the side that there's no solid evidence, 11% of Democrats say there's no solid evidence. 46% of Republicans. That's the same amount that said there was solid evidence. 46% say there is not. solid evidence of global warming. Of the people who did say there was solid evidence, 64%, 2/3, says it was mostly because of human activity. Only 23% of Republicans said it was mostly for human activity. So that's about 2/3 to about 1/4. That's a big difference between Republicans and Democrats, their rationality, the way they look at the world. All right, this is very scientific, fact-based stuff. Okay, but on a whole host of issues. I mean, economically speaking, Republicans, as I mentioned, are very ideological. Tax cuts and less regulation. If your house is on fire, put it out with tax cuts. Okay, I joke, but that's almost true. There's not evidence that tax cuts create jobs the way that they say they will create jobs. The trickle-down economics works. They believe in that stuff. There's no rational basis to it, really, or evidence-based support either. George H.W. Bush, a man I admire, said that this stuff was voodoo economics. All right, this Reagan right-wing give money to the rich and it'll all just trickle down nonsense. The rich like to keep it and enhance their own position. It's basically what they do. And we keep seeing downsizing, outsourcing, and investment in technology. All that's understandable, but the tax cuts don't create jobs for the most part. Now, that's just tax cuts. How about the war on drugs? Obviously that's broken. Obviously that doesn't work. That's not rational, but they keep wanting to pursue that. The Cuba embargo. The Republicans want to keep pursuing that. That's not rational. This is not all Republicans, by the way, but this is basically the Republican leadership. Doesn't work for half century, but keep doing it. Against legalization of marijuana. What's the rational, really, basis of that? There's just I can't think of a major issue where you have so many issues that they're just wrong on immigration, right? Hispanic immigrants, it's well established and well documented that they actually end up paying more into the system. They are afraid to take use of whatever benefits they can get because they don't want to get deported, but they're often still paying in payroll taxes and other stuff into the system. Republicans were overwhelmingly for the Iraq invasion. That was a disaster. I'll keep going for a little bit. Stem cell research, invaluable tool. They're against that. They think video games cause violent behavior. Look at Japan. They're not violent at all, and they play more video games, and they're very violent. Gun control. I mean, states with more gun laws have lower rates, generally speaking, of gun violence and gun murder. That's not, unrelated. I mean, I'm coming up with all the major crime, immigration, war and peace, social issues. They're totally against abortion, but we've seen in many ways that when you look at studies about how abortion affects society, when people can't have abortions and they have unwanted pregnancies and they don't take care of the kids or they're abandoned, that becomes a burden on society. That's difficult to back up with evidence as well, that having that as some sort of option some of the time is bad. I just can't see pollution. They basically just don't really care about it. I mean, honestly, they're always trying to weaken the EPA. They always get annoyed at environmentalists. Is that good policy? Am I partisan by siding with the Democrats on the fact that pollution is something we really need to be smart about? I mean, Republicans are generally even of the position that the Civil War was not about slavery, and that many of them at least think that the South was right. Are you kidding? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, there were even polls out a few years ago when President Obama, his administration was facing the first set of midterm elections, a Pew poll and a Time poll. Pew said about 18% of Americans thought Obama was a Muslim. And the Time poll said 24% of Americans thought Obama was a Muslim. In terms of the Republican breakdown, this ranges from 31% of Republicans to 46% of Republicans. As many as 46% of Republicans at that time thought President Obama was a Muslim. That's if I find two people, almost one of them thinks he's a Muslim. And in the Pew poll, this is even more telling. We see that Republicans, not only 31% with Pew saying that they think Obama's a Muslim, only 27% thought he was a Christian, and 39% that said they didn't know. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if he's... I mean, goodness. Totally irrational. There were similar beliefs about Obama being foreign-born and all this. And this is not a fact-based party. Sure, there's a significant minority, sometimes half, that aren't crazy. But my goodness, I mean, on all these issues I mentioned, pollution, immigration, the Iraq War, the war on drugs, climate change, they're on the wrong side of all these issues. Economics, they don't have an economic plan. They have tax cuts and less regulation. That's not an economic plan. So, for me, I look at these issues and I see a party with no plan or awful plan, and a very flawed party that at least wants to look at a policy solution, study it, a policy situation, study it, and try and figure out what the best approach is. You know, both Republicans and Democrats are against big spending, but they want to cut in different areas. It's not like Democrats don't acknowledge there's a problem with the debt and deficit. They do, and under the Obama administration, and with some help from the Republican Congress, which has been cutting stuff. I mean, we've seen the deficit cut in half. But honestly, I can't think of a major issue here where Republicans are right. And that doesn't make me partisan. That doesn't make me biased. If I'm always siding with the Democrats, regardless of what the issue is, if I'm always against Republicans, if I just look at it and say, this is what the Democrat believes, boom. Oh, there's a Democrat, I'll just vote for him. That makes me partisan. If I'm not doing that, I'm not. I'm simply looking at the facts. And if the Democrats happen to be right most of the time, that's the fault of the Republicans and their craziness and irrationality and lack of fact-based approaches to pretty much everything. Okay? So, sorry, that doesn't make me ideological. You know, I happen to side with the party that isn't ideological, that looks more at fact-based solutions and research. And, I mean, Republicans even have a disdain for academics. This is very well known. If you listen to their talk shows or oh, Harvard elitist. I mean, I'd rather have someone from Harvard informing what's going on than some regular Joe sitting on his, stool drinking some beer. I mean, goodness. But anyway, that doesn't make me partisan. Okay? It really doesn't. I can still be liberal, and I can pick a side, and I can do so as an informed person based on research and facts. And that just makes me smart. I'm sorry. And, there was a 12-point gap. 55% of people with advanced degrees voted for Obama last time, and 42% of people with advanced degrees voted for Romney. And Romney's not an idiot, but, the Republican Party has some serious issues. So if I'm liberal and I'm speaking out against Republicans, I'm honestly more of an anti-Republican than I am a Democrat. There's some very good reasons for that. So I think I've done a good job defending that charge. Now, I also presented a mountain of evidence about racial issues in America and how bad it is for black people. Let's look at some differences between, to conclude this segment, between Democrats and Republicans on that. Between white Republicans and white Democrats, and to Republicans' credit, at least a majority are not of this mindset, but, over 30% of white Republicans say too much money is being spent improving conditions for blacks. Considering how bad that is, it's obviously not the situation. But that's about 30%. With Democrats, white Democrats, it's less than 10. So that's 3 times the amount of Republicans are super blind to race on in terms of the spending a resource issue compared to Democrats. Okay. In addition, we have a little bit under 60% of Republicans, white Republicans, think that black people lack the motivation to pull themselves out of poverty. As if this community hasn't been trying super hard for years to better their condition. So that's over half, significantly over half. And it's not great with Democrats either. White Democrats, only about 40%. But still, that's a big difference. That's an almost 20-point difference. That's still a majority of Democrats recognizing reality and a majority of Republicans that are not. And just in general, if you look at that either a lot more needs to be done for racial equality, some more needs to be done, or only a little or nothing. Okay. Republicans, only 35% of Republicans think a lot needs to be done versus 63% of Democrats. 38% of Republicans say something needs to be done. Only 26% of Democrats say just something, as opposed to a lot. 22% of Republicans say just a little bit or nothing. 9% of Democrats just a little bit or nothing. Those are huge differences in each one of those gradations there. Okay? About 2-to-1 Democrats to Republicans think a lot needs to be done. And about 2-to-1 Republicans versus Democrats think little or nothing needs to be done, more than 2-to-1. Interestingly, people with more money think less needs to be done to help black people. That's quite interesting, to say the least. Now, we also have to talk about the Tea Party here, because the Tea Party has come to dominate the Republican Party, and they're a small vocal minority, but they're not that small, and because they've dominated the party publicly and in the primaries, they have a lot of other more moderate anyway, Republicans running scared. So they're changing their positions to conform to the Tea Party agenda in order to stay in office, or they're not voting against Tea Party moves, which means they really have come to dominate the Republican Party, especially in the House of Representatives. That's how we end up having a shutdown, and almost shutdowns multiple times. So this is because the moderate Republicans don't want to go on the record of doing anything to support Obama or going against the Tea Party. We saw a lot of moderate Republicans lose to more extreme candidates over the last few years. Republicans got a little bit better with toning down the crazy this last midterm, but the crazy is still there. They just toned it down a bit. If we look at the Tea Party, okay, this is compared to all Americans. 31% of white people in general think that white people have a better chance of getting ahead than black people. So 31% whites have a better shot. Only 16% of the Tea Party believes that. So that's half, compared to the regular public, half the Tea Party people understand half the amount of normal people. Compared to the general public that believes white people have a major advantage, only half the amount of people in the Tea Party think that as a percentage. Very few people think that black people have a better chance of getting ahead. 4% of the general population thinks that black people have a better chance of getting ahead. That's almost 7% for the Tea Party. So that's almost twice the amount as a percentage. And then 60% of everybody thinks that it's equal. 73% of Tea Partiers think it's equal. So, you know, that's also a big difference. The Tea Party thinks that 52% of them think too much has been made of problems facing black people. This is from a New York Times poll. The previous information was from a Pew poll, by the way. Several Pew polls, I believe. Out of all Americans, only 28% of them think that too much has been made out of problems facing the black community. But over half, 52% of Tea Partiers say that. That's a big deal. And as far as the Obama administration, does the Obama administration favor white people over black people over white people, or treat both equally? Very few people think that, you know, whites are favored over blacks by the Obama administration. 2% of everybody, 1% of the Tea Party. But favoring blacks over whites, 25% of the Tea Party thinks that's the situation. Only 11% of the general public. So that is more than twice the amount of the regular population believing that as a percentage. The extremism in the Tea Party, especially on race issues, and they're dominating the Republican Party. I mean, they're more extreme in almost all their beliefs, whether it's social issues, government. But I just wanted to highlight those aspects of the differences between the party and the dominant wing of the party. So I think that's important for people to understand. There are serious differences between the parties, and if you pick one party most of the time, that doesn't make you a partisan. If you're doing it based on facts and rationality, that's what you're supposed to do. It's your duty as a citizen. And frankly, the Republicans just don't have the facts and reason on their side. So that's why the most educated people, and I would say the most rational people, the really, really, really religious people who believe that there are 7,000 years old, that there's no evolution or global warming, those are the people who are supporting Republican policies the most. These same people who think that the Civil War isn't about slavery, and that Hispanic immigrants are going to ruin America. I'm sorry, so I'm against the craziness that has taken over the modern Republican Party. This is not the party of Eisenhower or Lincoln by any means anymore. I think we can blame a lot of that in the Reagan years. But anyway, that is how I feel on the charge that I'm ideological, partisan, whatever. I reject that. My final topic I'd like to talk about is a little more abstract. Sorry, I may have been blocking the microphone there. My final topic is a bit more abstract, but I'm thinking, it is Christmas. Christmas used to mean a lot to me. I don't, as I mentioned in my last podcast, I'm not really religious. It doesn't have the meaning for me it used to have. But a couple points. I'm living here in the Middle East, and Christians here, many people are being persecuted and treated awfully. But Christians are facing persecution in many areas here, unfortunately. Jordan's not one of them. I saw a red van going down a major street here with a guy in a Santa suit and two girls with reindeer elves waving to people today. And, that's a strongly Muslim majority country, and no one's killing them or shooting at them, and it was cool. A lot of stores are, because there's a Christian Arab minority here, a lot of stores are featuring Christmas deals, even if they're run by Muslims. They don't care. There's the Christians who run the liquor stores here, we're having deals for Ramadan, if you could believe that. So anyway, Jordan's an exception, though. In Iraq, it's been a horrible situation. In Syria now, it's getting tough. The cops in Egypt have had it quite quite a difficult time, and it's very sad. We're talking about an extremely old Christian community in the Middle East. These people were Christians before there ever was a U.S., when lots of Europeans were still not worshiping, Christianity. They were still doing their tribal religions. Not that that's better or worse, but I'm just saying, for someone who's a Christian in like the U.S., for example, you have to respect this community that goes back 2,000, almost 2,000 years. And Iraq at one point and other places in the Middle East actually was one of the great centers of Christianity in the Middle Ages. And there was a bigger, more established Christian community here than in Europe at one point. And now they're fading away. And in 2003, when we invaded Iraq, there were about 1 million Christians in Iraq. They're now down to about 250,000. And that was even before ISIS's onslaught, those crazy fanatic idiots, Islamic State freaks who are just awful. We've captured a Jordanian pilot now, and we have to hope for the best, but it's hard to expect the best in that situation. But, so many Christians have had to flee. Mosul was their last real stronghold in Iraq, and they fled that. So who knows how many are left now, but many, many have left since this summer with ISIS. And a lot of them came to churches here in Jordan. And they're having Christmas. And I'm sure they're not thinking about all the material possessions that they left. And they're happy to be alive. They're here starting over. They're with whatever family has survived. And they must really have a perspective that values the human element of what Christmas is supposed to be. And again, I'm not religious. I honestly think a lot of this stuff is silly. But at the same time, where I don't necessarily respect or have to respect the beliefs that these people have in terms of thinking they make sense or they're based on anything that's rational. There's still you have strength of their belief, the tradition, what this means to them. And it's something that's very serious to them. And for these people, whether they're Middle Eastern Christians or American Christians, the world was kind of, really messed up. And here comes Jesus and offers this message of love and peace and hope. And he gives hope to people who had lost their way, and presumably they were all going to hell because they were bad, and blah, blah, blah. But, the birth of Jesus is the arrival of hope in the Christian tradition. From out of nowhere, pretty much, and it's hope. And I hope that message isn't lost on them or these people. They've survived, and they'll continue. It's very, very sad that this almost 2,000-year-old community will not survive where they have been surviving and are having to start over. But those that are alive are still alive. They've got each other. And they've got the Muslim people of Jordan have been very supportive, for example. And there's some beautiful interfaith stuff going on here, and it needs to be written about more. But, you got Christian refugees sleeping in church pews here. And, it's awful. These people lost everything. And they were being crucified, tortured, murdered, killed, raped by ISIS, just like they were doing Yazidis and Shia Muslims and Sunnis who didn't agree with them. And, I think back to the U.S. I gotta say, Christmas in Jordan is kind of cool. There's a small but successful and somewhat prominent Christian minority here. And in stores here and there, you see some Christmas decorations, and it's kind of nice. Those Christmas decorations did not go up in October, which is when I remember the tree going up last year in the mall near where I lived. And I was horrified to see the Christmas tree going up in the first or second week of October. I just was horrified. And the nonstop 3 months of Christmas music and commercialization of Christmas. And there's some of it here too, yeah. But it's refreshing where for a few weeks people get some decorations up and get excited and this chocolate store run by a Muslim girl I know is a Christmas tree and Christmas candy for people, because it's cool like that here. And that's nice. In America, I feel like we've lost that in a lot of ways. Not completely, but you can sure bet the Christian community here is thinking about how lucky they are to be alive, to have each other, to still be surviving as a community. Uh, People here are scared of ISIS. One of my Jordanian friends just Facebook messaged me and asked about the pilot that was captured, and she was scared that ISIS was going to attack here and what was going to happen. And I think Jordan's going to be okay for a lot of reasons. I won't get into that here, but I told her, don't worry, really, things should be fine. But people are scared, and I think that the Christians here are having one of their most real Christmases ever. They're probably appreciating their faith, their traditions, their families, their loved ones, their friends, and their sense of community in a way that in their lifetime they've never been able to before, because they've never been threatened like this so much. They've never faced these types of persecutions in their lifetime, because nothing like this has happened in the Middle East for a very long time. And contrast that with people fighting in the U.S. and stressing out about shopping and deals and families fighting over all kinds of silly stuff and stressed out about, is everything going to be ready or not, and what do I get, and all that stuff. That's not what, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God here to bring hope to humanity. I don't. I think Jesus is a great guy with a great message that should be listened to. That doesn't mean I think he's the Son of God, and I don't. But if you do, Christmas is about hope. It's about sticking together and persevering and working towards building community and love and friendship, because that was what the early Christian community was. They were a family before it got all taken over by crazy ideologue bishops and the Roman government and all that, or they took it over, depending on how you look at it. But before all that, they were just communities and people helping each other, really, and coming together in love and brotherhood. That's what the early Christian movement is really about. That's not what I would argue a lot of the later stuff was about. But you're Christian. Think about these Middle East Christians on this Christmas, or whatever religion you are. Think about these people for 2,000 years suffering all kinds of persecution throughout the ages, but especially today. Their churches and holy stuff being attacked and destroyed and just driven from their homes where they've a lot of this was going on because of the Iraq war that the U.S. unleashed, but ISIS is really, what they've done in such a short period of time to this community is terrifying, frankly, for a community so long and so well established. So, I think our thoughts should be with them and appreciate what they're going through, and just remember, forget about stressing about the shopping and the gifts. And if you're having arguments with people, don't not talk to people. They're trying to, they're in your family, that you care about, that you love, that are close to you. Sorry to get so preachy here, but really, just remember what's important, really important, and make that Christmas. Ignore the monstrosity of a 3-month commercial spectacle that American culture has turned Christmas into, and think about these Middle Eastern Christians who are lucky to be alive, lucky to be together, and are starting over because of the generosity and support of other Christians nearby, and not just Christians, other Muslims as well, Muslims as well, and others around here. That's the real Christmas spirit. It's about love and family, and being around people who love you and that are close to you. And honestly, as someone who's not religious at all anymore, I still feel it this time of year. There's something about just wanting to be around the people you really love and appreciate. There's something about that closeness, those relationships, those bonds, thinking about what's really important in life. And it's, it's just before the end of the year where there's a chance to, it's just a day in the calendar, but still, everyone thinks about trying to start over and do new things and hope. So there's hope, love, family. I don't care about the faith stuff so much. Have faith in the people your friends and the people around you, and that things will get better. And if you are suffering, and a lot of people get sad this time of year for a lot of different reasons, I just want to mention briefly, one of the greatest shows I've ever seen in my life was HBO's The Leftovers, which is a show that really focuses on loss and pain and how people deal with that when they're not sure about how they're going to go forward, because we're never sure, where it's hard to have hope, where you've given up on hope. And just remember that if you're feeling this pain, if you're hurt, if you're sad, it means you're still feeling. There are people who go through so much that they lose themselves. They lose their soul. They lose their humanity. They don't feel anymore. They just look at stuff and they're numb to it. They don't care. They lost you, but they've given up on life. It's sad to say, but that happens to many people. And if you're still feeling that pain, it means you can still feel, and you've still got some semblance of yourself and your soul alive. One of my favorite movies, The Thin Red Line, there's this great scene with Sean Penn and John C. Reilly, and Sean Penn's character is just really tough, tough talking, not like screaming and yelling, but just he's a tough guy, this tough sergeant who's just, tries to not be emotional and tries to be like a rock, as one of the characters says to him. Why you always make yourself out to be like a rock, this character says, acting like you don't something like feel or care. And he's like, I always felt like you did, like you cared. And so Sergeant Welsh, Sean Penn's character, is sitting looking at wounded guys from his unit. And the other sergeant, I think he's a sergeant, John C. Reilly, is looking at these young guys struggling, dying, wounded, maimed, bloody. And he's saying, see that boy over there dying? I look at him, I feel nothing. Nothing at all. And there's some silence. And Sean Penn's character, who's throughout this movie, it's a long movie, The Thin Red Line, is very tough and stoic and non-emotive. He says, sounds like bliss. And then he says something along the lines of, I don't feel that yet, that numbness. And the movie is, in many ways, about his not feeling that numbness and what he does because he cares. So, I've had a tough year. I'm not going to lie. I've been down. I've had issues recently. And I'll tell you, the pain you feel is a reminder that you still have a heart, that you still feel. And I think about these Iraqi and other Christians here suffering, and not just the Christians. My goodness, I'm thinking a lot more about the Muslims in general, the millions of people in Syria and the Muslim Iraqis who've been suffering, and others, the Palestinians, Israelis, a lot of people who've been suffering in different levels, but still suffering nonetheless. And it's really sad, but at least there are some glimmers of hope, and there are some people who help each other and across religious and ethnic and racial and whatever lines. And whether we're talking about whites and blacks in the U.S. or Israelis and Palestinians, whether we're talking about liberals and conservatives and ideology and all that, the important thing is we gotta try to understand each other, try to put our minds in the other person's mind, walk in their shoes, try and reach out and try to come together. There's a lot that divides us, and sometimes the divisions need to be there, but we really need to work to be together more. Cops, civilians, officers, I should say, and civilians, black, white, Muslim, Christian, Israeli, Palestinian, whatever it is, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, my goodness, we've got to come together and work on these things. Do I think that's necessarily going to happen soon? No. But doesn't mean we can't work towards it, doesn't mean we can't hope for it. So, as I sign off on this podcast, this is me wishing you a hopeful and happy and friend and family filled holiday, whatever you're celebrating, if you're celebrating anything. And if you're not celebrating anything, celebrate your friends and family anyway. That's what I'm doing. I'm probably having a sort of pseudo Christmas thing anyway. I hate to admit it, but I think I might be watching Elf with a few people tomorrow. But anyway, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and whatever you're going through, don't give up hope, and let's all try to be there for each other in this next year, 2015. Thanks for listening. One quick note, if I make a mistake or misspeak in my podcast, my plan is at the very end of the next episode to address that. I might have said Islamabad when I was talking about the awful Taliban attack in Pakistan. It actually happened in, I hope I said this right, Peshawar.